Get on your knees, Latoya! Olivia's voice sliced through the Carver mansion's opulent air, venom dripping from every syllable. You stepped too close and dirtied my space. Beg for forgiveness, now! The demand echoed, a cruel spotlight on Latoya Jackson, a 32-year-old maid whose steady hands froze, her heart a drum of defiance. I work for you, not as your slave, she shot back, her voice low but unyielding, eyes burning with a fire no insult could douse. In the shadows, Henry, Olivia's fiancé, watched silently, his jaw tight. He'd excused her cruelty before, but this time his gaze lingered on the stranger who stood tall, a spark that might unravel their looming vows. Will Latoya's courage topple a dynasty, or will pride cost her everything? Hey, hit that subscribe button and share where you're tuning in, what time it is, and your predictions. Will justice rise or will secrets shatter? Stick around. You won't believe how this unfolds. Latoya Jackson's shoes tapped softly on the marble floor of the Carver mansion, each step a quiet rebellion against the weight of Olivia's venomous command still ringing in her ears. The sashes of silk in her arms shimmered under the chandelier's glow, their delicate folds a stark contrast to the calluses on her hands, earned from 8 years of serving a family that saw her as less. At 32, Latoya carried herself with a grace honed by necessity, her dark eyes sharp with a fire that refused to dim, even as the memory of Olivia's demand to kneel gnawed at her soul. The sashes were destined for the grand hall, where tomorrow's wedding would unfold in a spectacle of wealth. Latoya moved with precision, weaving through florists, hauling roses and caterers, balancing trays, their chatter a low hum beneath the piano's distant notes. She reached the hall, where tables stood like sentinels awaiting her touch. Each sash she draped was a small act of perfection, her fingers smoothing the fabric as if it could shield her from the carver's disdain. She'd heard Olivia's voice before, sharp, entitled, but today's cruelty had been different, a public blade meant to cut deep. As she adjusted a sash, her mind flickered to her mother's words spoken years ago in a cramped Atlanta kitchen. Don't let anyone trample your dignity, Latoya. The memory was a lifeline, anchoring her against the tide of humiliation. She'd dreamed of designing interiors, of crafting spaces that sang with beauty. But life had tethered her to this role, her wages sent to her sister's college fund. Yet in this moment, aligning the sashes with military precision, Latoya felt a spark of her old ambition, a whisper that she was more than the carver's maid. Latoya! Olivia's voice sliced through the hall, as if summoned by Latoya's defiance. The bride-to-be stood in the doorway, her turquoise dress clinging to her frame, blonde hair pulled tight like a crown. Her blue eyes raked over Latoya, searching for flaws. These sashes are uneven. Do you want my wedding to look like a thrift store sale? The words were a whip, cracking for all to hear. A florist nearby glanced up, then away, unwilling to intervene. Latoya's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed steady, a practiced shield. They're aligned, Miss Olivia. I'll double-check. She stepped to the nearest table, her fingers brushing the silk, though she knew it was flawless. Olivia's heels clicked closer, her presence a storm cloud. You'd better, she snapped. And don't step so close when you work near me. Your apron's filthy. Keep your distance. The insult landed like a stone, heavy with intent. Latoya's pulse quickened, her mind flashing to the intro's moment. Olivia's demand to kneel, her own refusal. I work for you, not as your slave. She met Olivia's gaze, holding it a beat too long, her silence louder than any retort. I'll keep that in mind, Miss Olivia, she said, her tone cool but edged with steel. Olivia's lips pursed, sensing the defiance but unable to pin it down. She turned, her heels echoing like gunfire as she left. Latoya exhaled, her hands trembling slightly as she resumed her work. The hall buzzed around her, workers hauling chairs, a violinist tuning strings, but she felt alone, a warrior in a gilded cage. She thought of Henry, Olivia's fiancé, his quiet observation during that earlier confrontation. His eyes had held something, discomfort, perhaps pity, but Latoya didn't trust it. Men like him, polished and privileged, rarely crossed the Carvers, yet his presence had lingered, a question mark in her mind. She moved to the next table, her fingers deft despite the weight in her chest. The carver's wealth was a currency of power, and Latoya was their coin to spend. 8 years she'd endured their slights, Helen's pointed critiques, Olivia's growing cruelty. But today's demand to kneel had shifted something inside her. It wasn't just about stepping too close. It was about her existence, her blackness, her refusal to bow. She'd stayed for her sister, for the paycheck. But how much longer could she bend? A soft voice broke her thoughts. "You okay, Latoya?" Tasha, a young server with wide eyes, stood nearby, clutching a tray. Latoya forced a smile, masking the storm within. "Just keeping up, Tasha. How's the kitchen?" Tasha leaned closer, whispering, "Mrs. Carver's on a rampage. Watch yourself. She's got it out for you today." Latoya nodded, her smile fading. Helen's wrath was a shadow over them all, but Latoya felt its weight most keenly. She returned to the sashes, each fold a defiance, each breath a vow. The piano's notes grew louder, a prelude to tonight's engagement party, where Olivia would shine and Latoya would fade into the background. But fading wasn't surrender. She thought of her mother's words again, a single spark in the dark. "Don't let them trample your dignity." Tomorrow the wedding would test her, Olivia's demands, Helen's scrutiny, the carver's world closing in, and something told her it wouldn't be like any other day. Latoya paused by a window, the garden's roses a blur of crimson against the glass. She saw her reflection, tired, resolute, unbroken. The fire in her eyes burned brighter, fueled by a truth she'd always known. She was more than their maid, more than their slights. Tonight she'd serve their champagne, but tomorrow she'd face their storm, and she'd do it standing. Latoya Jackson glided through the Carver Mansion's grand hall, her black and white uniform a stark contrast to the kaleidoscope of silk gowns and tailored suits swirling around her. The engagement party was in full bloom, chandeliers casting a golden glow over guests whose laughter rang like clinking crystal. Latoya's silver tray, heavy with champagne flutes, trembled slightly in her hands, not from the weight, but from the memory of Olivia's morning venom, her demand to kneel still a raw wound. At 32, Latoya had learned to move like a shadow, unseen yet essential. But tonight, each step felt like a tightrope, walk over a pit of scorn. She offered a flute to a guest, her smile a practiced mask, though her feet ached from hours of labor. The violin's mournful notes wove through the air, a counterpoint to the chatter of Atlanta's elite. Latoya's eyes scanned the crowd, alert for Olivia's crimson silhouette. The bride-to-be's earlier command, "Don't step so close," had been a warning, a line drawn in the sand. Latoya had crossed it by refusing to bow, and now the air crackled with the promise of retribution. She navigated toward a buffet table, where caviar gleamed like dark pearls. As she passed a cluster of guests, a flash of red caught her eye. Olivia, radiant in her silk gown, holding court among her friends. Latoya's pulse quickened, but she kept her trajectory steady, determined to remain invisible. Then, as if sensing her, Olivia turned, her blue eyes locking onto Latoya like a hawk spotting prey. With a deliberate flick of her wrist, Olivia's champagne flute tipped, splashing golden liquid onto the marble floor inches from Latoya's feet. "Latoya!" Olivia's voice cut through the music, sharp enough to halt nearby conversations. "You stepped too close again. Look at this mess." The accusation was a performance, her lips curling in a cruel smile. Guests turned, their eyes darting between the bride and the maid. Latoya's chest tightened, the tray in her hands a lifeline. "I'm sorry, Miss Olivia," she said, her voice calm but firm, bending to set the tray down. "I'll clean it right away." Olivia stepped closer, her heels clicking like a countdown. "Sorry isn't enough," she hissed, loud enough for her audience. "You've dirtied my night. Kneel and apologize properly, or do you think you're above it?" The word kneel was a blade, slicing through Latoya's resolve. Her mind flashed to her mother's voice, a distant echo. "Don't let them trample your dignity." She straightened, meeting Olivia's gaze. "I've apologized, Miss Olivia," she said, her tone unyielding. "That's enough." A murmur rippled through the onlookers, some chuckling, others shifting uncomfortably. Olivia's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. "Enough? she mocked. You're a maid, Latoya. Know your place. The insult landed like a slap, but Latoya held her ground, her silence a shield. She knelt only to wipe the spill, her movements deliberate, every swipe of the cloth a defiance. As she rose, a figure emerged from the crowd. Henry Reynolds, Olivia's fiancé, his vest immaculate, but his expression clouded. Latoya, are you all right? Henry's voice was low, almost lost in the violin's swell, but it carried a weight that stilled the air. Latoya glanced at him, surprised by the concern in his hazel eyes. I'm fine, sir, she said, her voice steady but guarded. She didn't trust his kindness, not yet. Henry's gaze flicked to Olivia, who laughed, a brittle sound. Henry, don't fuss over her, she said, waving a hand. She's just clumsy. Henry didn't smile. She apologized, Olivia, he said, his tone measured but edged. Let it go. The words were a crack in the facade, a hint of fracture in their polished union. Olivia's lips parted, but no retort came. She turned back to her friends, dismissing Latoya with a flick of her hair. But the tension lingered, a storm gathering strength. Latoya retrieved her tray, retreating to the kitchen's dim sanctuary. Her hands shook as she set it down, the champagne flutes clinking softly. Tasha, the young server, appeared at her side, eyes wide. You stood up to her again, she whispered, awe lacing her voice. Miss Olivia's furious. Latoya forced a smile, masking the churn in her gut. I just did my job, Tasha, she said, but her words felt hollow. She'd defied Olivia twice now, and the Carvers didn't forgive defiance. In the quiet of the kitchen, Latoya leaned against a counter, the cold steel grounding her. She thought of her sketches hidden in her apartment, designs for rooms that breathe warmth and freedom. This mansion, with its crystal and marble, was a cage, and Olivia's cruelty was its lock. But Henry's intervention, brief, unexpected, had sparked a question. Why had he spoken for her? Was it pity or something deeper? She pushed the thought away, unwilling to hope. Men like Henry didn't challenge the Carver's world. The violin's notes drifted in, a reminder of the night's demands. Latoya straightened, smoothing her uniform. Tomorrow's wedding loomed, a gauntlet of Olivia's wrath and Helen's scrutiny. She'd face it as she always had, with her head high, her fire unquenched. But as she stepped back into the hall, tray in hand, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Olivia's, perhaps, or Henry's. The game had changed, and Latoya knew one truth. She wouldn't kneel, not tonight, not ever. The dawn light filtered through the Carver mansion's windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors, where Latoya Jackson moved with relentless precision. The sting of Olivia's public humiliation at last night's engagement party lingered like a bruise, her demand to kneel a wound that refused to close. Yet Latoya's hands were steady as she arranged chairs in the garden, each placement a silent act of defiance. At 32, she learned to bury hurt beneath duty, but the fire in her chest burned hotter now, fueled by the memory of her own words. I work for you, not as your slave. The wedding day had arrived, and the air crackled with the promise of a reckoning. The garden hummed with activity, florists weaving roses into arches, caterers hauling silver trays, a violinist testing notes that floated like fragile hopes. Latoya's checklist was a lifeline. Aligned chairs, polished tables, check flowers. She moved swiftly, her black uniform crisp despite the summer heat, her eyes scanning for flaws the Carvers would pounce on. She passed Tasha, the young server, who whispered, Mrs. Carver's watching you like a hawk today. Latoya nodded, her jaw tight. Let her watch, she murmured, her voice low but resolute. She'd faced Olivia's venom. Helen's scrutiny was just another storm. She entered the grand hall, where tables gleamed under her earlier touch. As she adjusted a centerpiece of white roses, Helen Carver swept in, her beige linen dress rustling like a warning. Her gray eyes raked over the room, landing on a single, misaligned spoon. Latoya, she said, her voice ablade, this is my daughter's wedding, not some back-alley diner. Fix it. Latoya's fingers moved instantly, realigning the spoon with precision. Yes, ma'am, she said, her tone even. though her pulse thrummed with suppressed anger. Helen lingered, her gaze heavy. "You're lucky to have this job," she added. "Don't test my patience." The words were a familiar jab, but they stung sharper after last night's clash. Latoya held Helen's stare a moment too long, then turned back to her work, her silence a shield. She thought of her sketches, hidden in her apartment, designs for spaces where no one was made small. This mansion, with its marble and wealth, was a prison, and she was done bending. But the paycheck, her sister's tuition, kept her tethered, a chain she couldn't yet break. As she carried a stack of napkins to the bridal suite, Olivia's voice echoed from the hallway, sharp and impatient. "Latoya, bring my dress, now!" Latoya's stomach nodded, but she complied, lifting the gown's delicate lace with care. The hallway was narrow, lined with gilded mirrors reflecting Olivia's approaching figure. Latoya stepped aside, but Olivia moved closer, deliberately brushing the dress against the wall. The lace caught, dragging across the floor, and Olivia spun, her eyes blazing. "You stepped too close," she snapped, her voice loud enough to draw nearby staff. "Look at this. My dress is filthy. Kneel and apologize, Latoya, or you're done." The demand hung like a guillotine, the air thick with onlookers' stares. Latoya's heart pounded, her hands gripping the gown's hem. She saw Henry in her mind's eye, his quiet intervention last night. But he wasn't here now. This was her fight. "I'm sorry the dress touched the wall, Miss Olivia," she said, her voice steady, each word deliberate. "I'll have it cleaned, but I won't kneel." The refusal was a spark, igniting gas from a maid nearby. Olivia's face flushed, her lips trembling with rage. "You think you're above me?" she hissed, stepping closer, her perfume suffocating. Latoya stood tall, her eyes locked on Olivia's, unflinching. "I'm doing my job," she said. "That's enough." The words were a line in the sand, a vow she'd never cross. Helen appeared, drawn by the commotion, her voice ice cold. "Latoya, kneel and apologize, or you're out of this house by noon." The threat was a thunderclap, but Latoya's resolve was iron. "I've apologized," she said, her voice unwavering. "I don't need to kneel to prove it." A maid dropped a tray, the clatter echoing, but Latoya didn't flinch, her gaze holding Helen's like a challenge. Olivia laughed, a brittle sound, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "You'll regret this," she spat, turning away, her gown sweeping the floor. Helen's stare lingered, her silence more dangerous than words. Latoya felt the weight of their power, the paycheck she needed, the sister she supported. But she also felt the fire within, the truth she'd spoken last night echoing in her soul. She wasn't their slave, and she wouldn't bow. She returned to the garden, her hands steady as she adjusted a final chair. The violin's notes grew louder, a prelude to the ceremony, but to Latoya, they sounded like a battle hymn. Tasha slipped beside her, whispering, "You're braver than all of us." Latoya's lips curved, a faint smile masking her fear. "Just doing what's right," she said, but her heart raced. The wedding was hours away, and the carver's wrath was a storm-gathering force. She thought of Henry, his unexpected kindness, and wondered if he'd seen her stand just now. Would he act again, or was his sympathy a fleeting thing? Latoya glanced at the rose arch, its petals trembling in the breeze. The mansion's grandeur loomed behind her, a fortress of wealth and cruelty. She was one woman, one spark, but she felt the fire growing. Today would test her, Olivia's vengeance, Helen's threats, the weight of her own choices. And as the sun climbed higher, she knew one truth. She'd face it all standing, her dignity a flame no carver could extinguish. Latoya Jackson's footsteps echoed softly in the Carver mansion's bridal suite, each one a pulse of defiance against the morning's clash, where Olivia's demand to kneel had nearly shattered her resolve. The room was a sanctuary of opulence, mirrors reflecting cascades of white roses, the air heavy with the bride's jasmine perfume. But to Latoya, it was a battlefield. She carried a velvet box containing Olivia's veil, her hands steady despite the fire in her chest. At 32, she'd faced the carver's scorn for years. But today's confrontation in the hallway, "I won't kneel," had drawn a line she wouldn't cross, no matter the cost. The suite buzzed with the chatter of bridesmaids, their silk dresses rustling as they fussed over Olivia, who stood before a full-length mirror, her wedding gown a shimmering cascade of lace. Latoya set the veil box on a table, her movements precise, her eyes avoiding the bride's reflection. She felt Helen's threat. "You're out by noon," like a noose, but her mother's words, a faint echo from years past, held her upright. "Don't let them trample your dignity." She was here to do her job, not to bow. "Latoya!" Olivia's voice cut through the chatter, sharp as a blade. She turned from the mirror, her blue eyes glinting with malice. "You still haven't learned, have you? You disrespected me in that hallway." The bridesmaids fell silent, their gazes darting between the two women. Latoya's pulse quickened, but she stood tall, her voice calm. "I apologize for the dress, Miss Olivia," she said. "I'll ensure it's perfect for your day." Olivia stepped closer, her gown swishing like a storm. "An apology isn't enough," she snapped, her voice loud for her audience. "This is my wedding, and you'll show respect. Kneel, Latoya, and beg forgiveness, right now." The word kneel was a whip, cracking through the room. A bridesmaid gasped. Another looked away, but Latoya's eyes locked onto Olivia's, unyielding. "I'm sorry if I upset you," she said, her tone steady, each word a stone in her defense. "But I work for you, not as your slave. I won't kneel." The air turned electric, the silence deafening. Olivia's face flushed crimson, her lips trembling with rage. "How dare you!" she shrieked, stepping forward, her hand rising in a flash. The slap landed hard across Latoya's cheek, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Pain seared through her, but Latoya didn't flinch, her eyes blazing with a fire that refused to be doused. The bridesmaids froze, one clutching her necklace, another stepping back, their silence a coward's agreement. The door swung open and Henry Reynolds strode in, his vest slightly askew, his face taut with urgency. He'd come to check on Olivia, but his eyes widened at the scene. Latoya, cheek red, standing defiant. Olivia trembling with fury. "Olivia, stop!" Henry's voice was a thunderclap, cutting through the tension. He stepped between them, his broad frame a shield. "She apologized," he said, his tone low but fierce. "What more do you want?" Olivia's eyes widened, her voice shaking. "Henry, she's insolent. She disrespected me. On our day." Henry's gaze didn't waver, his hazel eyes locking onto hers. "No, Olivia," he said, his voice like steel. "You're humiliating her for no reason. She's a person, not your property." The words hung heavy, a fracture in the polished veneer of their engagement. Latoya's breath caught, her cheek still burning, but Henry's defense was a spark in the dark, unexpected and raw. Olivia stammered, her gown trembling with her rage. "You're taking her side," she hissed, her eyes darting to the bridesmaids, seeking allies. None spoke. Henry turned to Latoya, his voice softer but firm. "You don't deserve this," he said. "I'm sorry." Latoya nodded, her throat tight, her voice a whisper. "Thank you, sir." She held his gaze a moment, seeing something, regret, perhaps, or resolve, that she hadn't expected from a man of his world. Olivia's laugh was brittle, a desperate attempt to reclaim control. "Henry, you're ruining everything," she cried, her voice cracking. Henry shook his head, his expression unreadable. "If this is who you are, Olivia, I've misjudged you." He turned, striding out, leaving the room in stunned silence. The bridesmaids shifted, one muttering, but Olivia stood frozen, her gown a mockery of her triumph. Latoya moved to leave, her cheek throbbing, her heart a drum of pride and fear. She felt the weight of every eye, the bridesmaids, Olivia's, even the absent Henry's. She'd stood her ground, but the cost was looming. Tasha's warning from the garden echoed, Mrs. Carver's watching. Helen's threat was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. Yet as Latoya stepped into the hallway, the cool air a balm on her heated skin, she felt a fire growing within her, stronger than ever. The violin outside swelled, signaling the ceremony's approach. But to Latoya, it was a call to battle. She thought of her sketches, her dream of creating spaces where no one was diminished. Olivia's slap, Helen's threats. They were chains she refused to wear. Henry's stand had been a shock, a crack in the carver's armor. But Latoya didn't dare hope it would save her. She was her own salvation, her dignity a flame that burned brighter with each step. The wedding was moments away, and the storm was breaking. She'd face it, as always, standing tall. Latoya Jackson stood at the garden's edge. The Carver mansions rose late in arches, casting long shadows across her path. The sting of Olivia's slap still burned her cheek, a searing reminder of the bridal suite's confrontation. But Henry's stand, "She's a person, not your property," echoed louder, a spark in the gathering storm. The wedding ceremony had begun, the air thick with the scent of roses and the violin's mournful canon in Latoya's black uniform clung to her skin in the summer heat, her checklist forgotten in her pocket. At 32, she'd faced the Carver's cruelty before, but today felt different, a breaking point, a moment where her refusal to kneel could unravel everything. Guests filled the white chairs, their silk dresses and tailored suits a tapestry of wealth under the golden sun. Latoya lingered near the back, her eyes scanning the crowd, half expecting Helen's wrath to descend. She'd been ordered out by noon, her job hanging by a thread, but she couldn't leave, not yet. The fire in her chest, kindled by years of swallowed slights, demanded she see this through. She thought of her sketches, dreams of designing spaces where no one was forced to bow. That dream felt closer now, fueled by her defiance and Henry's unexpected alliance. On the rose-draped pulpit, Olivia stood radiant, her lace gown shimmering like a mirage. Her smile was a brittle mask, her eyes darting to Henry, who stood beside her, his face a study in restraint. The officiant's voice droned, calling for vows, but Latoya sensed the fracture beneath the ceremony's polish. Guests whispered, their glances flickering toward her, the maid who dared to stand tall. She caught Tasha's eye across the garden, the young server nodding in silent solidarity, her tray abandoned. Henry stepped forward, the microphone amplifying his breath. The crowd hushed, expecting words of love, but his voice was steel, cutting through the violin strains. "I need to say something," he said, his gaze locking onto Olivia. "Today I saw you demand Latoya kneel for a mistake she'd already apologized for. You struck her, Olivia, because she wouldn't bow. I can't marry someone who treats another human being like that. Not because of her job, not because of her skin." His words were a thunderclap, rippling through the guests like a shockwave. Olivia's face drained of color, her gown trembling as she gripped the bouquet. "Henry, you're making a scene," she hissed, her voice cracking over the microphone. "She was disrespectful. This is our day." Henry shook his head, his hazel eyes unyielding. "No, Olivia, it's not about disrespect. It's about cruelty. I thought I knew you, but I was wrong." He turned to the officiant, his voice firm. "This wedding is off." Gasps erupted, chairs creaking as guests leaned forward, their murmurs a rising tide. Helen Carver surged from the front row, her beige dress a blur as she stormed the pulpit. "Henry, you traitor!" she shouted, her voice shrill with rage. "She's just a maid. You're throwing away everything for her?" Henry faced her, unflinching. "I'm throwing away a lie," he said. "If this is your family's way, I want no part of it." He stepped down, his shoes crunching on the gravel path, leaving Olivia frozen, her bouquet wilting in her hands. Latoya's heart pounded, her breath shallow. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted the wedding to collapse. But Henry's words were a vindication, a mirror to her own fire. Guests began to rise, some whispering, others grabbing purses, their exodus a slow unraveling of the Carver's grandeur. A woman in a sapphire dress muttered, "That maid caused all this." But another snapped, "No, the Carvers did. They went too far." Latoya stood rooted, her cheek still throbbing, but her spine was iron, her dignity intact. Olivia's sob broke the air, a raw, desperate sound as she sank onto the pulpit, her gown pooling like spilled moonlight. Helen tried to rally the crowd, her voice frantic. "Please stay. We'll fix this." But the guests streamed toward the parking lot, their chatter a chorus of scandal. Latoya felt their eyes, some curious, some accusing, but she met them with a steady gaze. She'd lost her job, her lifeline, but she'd kept something greater, herself. Tasha slipped beside her, whispering, "You did this, Latoya. You stood up, and now look." Latoya shook her head, her voice soft. "I just didn't kneel, Tasha. Henry did the rest." But her words carried a quiet pride, a spark that hadn't been there before. The garden, once a stage for celebration, was now a graveyard of the carver's ambitions. The violin fell silent, its notes replaced by the crunch of gravel under departing feet. Latoya turned toward the mansion's gate, her steps deliberate, the sun warm on her face. She thought of her sketches, her dream of a life beyond these walls. Henry's stand had been a shock, a crack in the carver's world, but she didn't dare hope it would shield her from Helen's wrath. The future was uncertain, but as she walked, her uniform no longer a chain, she felt a truth settle in her bones. She'd never kneel again. The storm had broken, and she was ready for whatever came next. The morning sun spilled through the single window of Latoya Jackson's Atlanta apartment, painting her small kitchen in hues of gold. A week had passed since the Carver wedding crumbled, since Henry's voice had shattered the ceremony with a truth Latoya hadn't dared hope for. "I can't marry someone who treats another human being like that." She sat at her worn table, a chipped mug of coffee in hand, the steam curling like a whisper of possibility. At 32, Latoya had lost her job, her lifeline, but the fire in her chest, ignited by her refusal to kneel, burned brighter than ever, a beacon in the uncertainty of her future. The apartment was modest, its walls lined with thrift store art, but a corner held her treasure, a stack of sketches, designs for rooms that breathe warmth and freedom. Latoya's fingers traced a drawing of a cozy lounge, her dream of designing interiors now a faint pulse of hope. The carver's cruelty, Olivia's slap, Helen's threats, had cost her dearly, but standing tall had given her something greater, herself. She sipped her coffee, its bitterness grounding her, as her phone buzzed with a message from Tasha. "You're the talk of the town. People can't stop speaking about you." Latoya's lips curved, a mix of pride and unease. She hadn't meant to topple a wedding, but the ripples of that day were spreading. Tasha arrived soon after, her knock sharp against the thin door. "Latoya, you should hear it out there," she said, eyes wide as she stepped inside, her braids swinging. "Guests from the wedding are telling everyone how you stood up to Olivia, how Henry walked away. The Carvers are losing contracts left and right." Latoya leaned back, her mug warm in her hands. "I just didn't kneel, Tasha," she said softly. "I didn't ask for this." Tasha grinned, undeterred. "Maybe not, but you started something. Folks are saying the Carvers showed their true colors, treating you like that because of who you are." She paused, her voice softening. "You gave us courage, you know. Me, the other staff, we're proud of you." Latoya's throat tightened, her eyes drifting to her sketches. She'd spent 8 years invisible in the Carver mansion, but now her defiance had made her seen, not just as a maid, but as a woman who'd sparked change. Her phone chimed again, an email from Clara Evans, owner of an Atlanta interior design firm. "I heard about your stand at the Carver wedding," it read. "Your strength is remarkable. We need someone like you on our team. Would you consider a role as a design assistant?" Latoya's breath caught, her heart racing. The words were a lifeline, a chance to step into the dream she'd buried under years of scrubbing floors. She read the email twice, her fingers trembling, the sketches on her table suddenly vivid with possibility. But the moment was cut short by another call, Helen Carver's name flashing on the screen. Latoya's stomach nodded, but she answered, her voice steady. "Latoya, you've ruined us," Helen spat, her tone venomous. "Our reputation, our deals, all because of your insolence. I'll sue you for destroying my daughter's wedding." Latoya's grip tightened on the phone, her cheek still carrying the phantom sting of Olivia's slap. "Mrs. Carver," she said, her voice like steel, "the truth doesn't need my defense. You and Olivia broke your own world." She hung up, her pulse thundering, a rush of freedom washing over her. She stood, pacing to the window, where children laughed on the street below, their voices a reminder of life beyond the Carver's shadow. Helen's threat was real, but Latoya felt unshackled, her fear replaced by a fire she hadn't known she possessed. She thought of Henry, his bold stand at the ceremony, and checked her email again. A new message from him waited. "Latoya, I'm sorry for what you endured. Your courage showed me who the Carvers really are. If you need help finding work, I'm here. Latoya's fingers hovered over the reply button, gratitude mingling with resolve. Thank you, she typed, but I'll stand on my own. She hit send, her heart light but firm. Tasha, still lingering, watched her with awe. You're really something, Latoya, she said. What's next? Latoya glanced at her sketches, the lounge design glowing in the sunlight. I'm thinking bigger, she said, her voice soft but certain. Maybe a place of my own one day, where no one's made to feel small. Tasha's eyes lit up. I'd work for you in a heartbeat, she said, and Latoya laughed, the sound a rare release. The apartment felt alive, its walls no longer a cage but a canvas for her future. The Carvers' empire was crumbling, their cruelty laid bare by whispers that spread like wildfire. Latoya didn't know if Helen's threat would materialize, but she knew one thing. She'd never bow again. Clara's offer was a door, her sketches a map, and Tasha's faith a spark. She thought of the garden, the roses that had witnessed her stand, and felt a truth settle in her bones. She was no longer their maid. She was Latoya Jackson, and her fire would light the way. The Atlanta sun streamed through the glass walls of Clara Evans' design studio, bathing Latoya Jackson's desk in a glow that felt like freedom. 2 months had passed since the Carver wedding's collapse, since her refusal to kneel had sparked a fire that still burned in her chest. Now at 32, Latoya sat sketching a modern dining room, her pencil dancing across paper with a confidence she hadn't known in the Carver mansion's shadows. Her crisp white blouse replaced the maid's uniform, her posture no longer braced for slights. The hum of creativity, colleagues debating color swatches, the scent of fresh coffee, replaced the Carver's venom, and Latoya felt alive. Her dream of designing interiors no longer a distant star, but a flame within reach. She adjusted a line on her sketch, envisioning warm oak tables under soft lighting. Clara's offer had been a lifeline, pulling her from the wreckage of her lost job. Latoya had learned fast, her eye for detail, honed by years of perfecting the Carver's tables, now crafting spaces that welcomed rather than oppressed. She glanced at a framed photo on her desk, a sketch of a cozy lounge from her apartment, a reminder of the studio she dreamed of owning. The Carver's cruelty, Olivia's slap, Helen's threats, had forged her, and she wore her scars like armor. Latoya, your layout's stunning, Clara said, leaning over her desk, her silver hair catching the light. The client loved your lighting ideas. You've got a gift. Latoya's cheeks warmed, her smile genuine. Thank you, Ms. Clara, she said, her voice steady but laced with pride. I'm just getting started. Clara's eyes twinkled. I knew you were special when I heard about that wedding. Standing up to the Carvers? That's rare courage. Latoya nodded, the memory of Olivia's demand. Kneel and beg. A distant sting, now fuel for her fire. A tap on her shoulder broke the moment. James, a lanky designer with a familiar grin, stood there, once a server under the Carver's thumb. You hear about Helen? He asked, keeping his voice low. She's dodging events now. Nobody wants to deal with them after the wedding mess. Olivia's lying low too. Latoya's brow lifted, a mix of satisfaction and indifference. They built that cage themselves, and she said, her tone cool. James chuckled. You kicked it open, though. I left because of you. Couldn't stomach their nonsense anymore. His words landed softly, a testament to the spark she'd ignited. Latoya returned to her sketch, but her mind wandered to Tasha's visit last week, the young server bursting with news of a community event honoring her. They're calling you the woman who didn't kneel, Tasha had said, eyes shining. The event, held at a local church, had drawn dozens, former Carver staff, neighbors, even wedding guests who'd spread her story. Latoya had spoken briefly, her voice catching as she said, I stood for my dignity, but you all made it mean more. The applause had been a balm, a chorus of hands lifting her higher than the Carvers ever could. Her computer pinged, an email from Olivia Carver snapping her back to the present. Latoya, I was wrong to treat you that way, it read. I'm trying to change. Please forgive me. Latoya's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her jaw tight. The words seemed sincere, but she saw Olivia's raised hand. heard her venomous kneel. She closed the email without replying, her heart a tangle of anger and caution. Forgiveness might come, but only when Olivia's actions matched her words. James, catching her expression, raised a brow. "Trouble?" he asked. Latoya shook her head. "Just the past knocking. I'm not answering yet." The studio's energy shifted as Clara called a meeting, and Latoya joined her team, presenting her dining room design. Her voice, once muted by the carver's scorn, now carried authority, her ideas sparking nods from colleagues. As she spoke, she felt the fire within her grow, a vision of her own studio, Latoya's vision, taking shape. She imagined a space where every worker was valued, where no one was forced to bow. The dream was no longer a sketch, but a blueprint, each day at Clara's building its foundation. After the meeting, Latoya lingered at her desk, her sketch glowing under the desk lamp. Tasha's text buzzed through. "Church event raised $500 for you. We believe in you." Latoya's eyes stung, gratitude swelling in her chest. She thought of the wedding garden, the roses that had witnessed her stand, and felt a truth take root. She wasn't alone. The carver's empire was fading, their cruelty a fading echo, but Latoya's world was expanding, built on the hands that lifted her now. A knock at the studio door drew her gaze. Mr. Thompson, a client from the church event, stood there, his smile warm. "Latoya, your story moved me," he said. "If you ever start your own firm, I'll back you." Latoya's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Thank you, sir, but I'll build it myself, step by step." He nodded, respect in his eyes, and left her with a spark of possibility. She turned back to her sketch, her pencil moving with purpose, each line a promise to herself. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the studio. Latoya packed her bag, her blouse a symbol of her new life. The carvers had tried to break her, but they'd only forged her stronger. Olivia's apology, Helen's threats, they were ghosts she'd outrun. As she stepped into the Atlanta evening, the city's pulse matched her own, a rhythm of hope and fire. Her journey was just beginning, and she'd walk it with her head high, her dream a flame no one could extinguish. The Atlanta evening glowed through the glass walls of Latoya's vision, Latoya Jackson's design studio, its simple sign a beacon above the bustling street. A year had passed since the Carver wedding imploded, since her refusal to kneel had set her free from their gilded cage. Now at 32, Latoya stood amid her creation, her teal dress catching the light of handmade lamps she'd crafted herself. The studio's opening buzzed with life, guests admiring her designs, their laughter mingling with jazz from a corner speaker. Latoya's heart swelled, her journey from maid to visionary a fire that burned brighter than ever, illuminating the space she'd built from ashes. The studio was her masterpiece, oak tables draped in linen, walls adorned with her sketches framed in gold, potted ferns softening the modern edges. Each piece reflected her dream, spaces where no one felt small. She greeted guests, her smile radiant, no longer the guarded mask of the Carver mansion. 2 months at Clara Evans' firm had taught her to wield her talent. A year of grit had built this. She thought of Tasha's words at the church event, "You're the woman who didn't kneel," and felt that truth in every step, her heels clicking with purpose. "Latoya, this place is stunning," Clara said, her silver hair gleaming as she surveyed a display of Latoya's community project, a free art space for kids. "You've turned pain into beauty." Latoya's eyes softened. "Couldn't have started without you, Miss Clara," she said, her voice warm. She led a tour, pointing out a mural of Atlanta's skyline, its lines echoing her sketches from that cramped apartment a year ago. Guests nodded, their murmurs a chorus of awe, and Latoya felt seen, not as a maid, but as a creator. Tasha burst through the crowd, her braids swinging, a grin splitting her face. "You did it, Latoya," she said, hugging her fiercely. "Half the old Carver staff are here. They're proud as hell." Latoya laughed, squeezing her back. James, the former server-turned-designer, joined them, gesturing to a client. "That guy's signing with us," he said. "Your community project sold him." Latoya's chest tightened, gratitude mixing with pride. These were her people, her strength, the hands that had lifted her when the Carvers tried to break her. A familiar figure approached, Henry Reynolds, his suit casual but sharp, his hazel eyes warm. "Latoya, this is incredible," he said, his voice carrying the same resolve that had stopped the wedding. "You've built something real." She smiled, no longer wary of his kindness. "Thank you, Henry," she said. "Your stand that day, it gave me space to breathe." He shook his head. "You gave yourself that space. I just saw the truth." He paused, his gaze distant. "I cut ties with the Carvers. I'm working on projects that matter now, helping communities, not empires." Latoya nodded, seeing in him a mirror of her own rebirth. Whispers from Tasha had brought news of the Carvers' fall. Helen, once a titan, now shunned social circles, her tech empire bleeding clients as her cruelty became legend. Olivia had joined an anti-racism group. Her efforts were tentative but public. A letter from her had arrived at the studio, handwritten, its words raw. "I'm sorry, Latoya. I'm learning to be better." Latoya hadn't responded, her heart still guarded. Olivia's slap, her venom, kneel and beg, lingered. But Latoya didn't need her remorse. She'd built this world without it, her fire needing no apology to burn. A guest's tap on her shoulder broke her thoughts. Mr. Thompson, the client from the church event, raised a glass. "To Latoya," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "A woman who stood tall and built something extraordinary." The room erupted in applause, and Latoya's eyes stung, her smile unwavering. She stepped to a small podium, the jazz fading as guests turned to her. "I was once told to kneel for a mistake I'd already apologized for," she began, her voice clear, resonant. "I chose to stand. That choice led me here, to a place where everyone is seen, valued. Don't let anyone dim your light." The crowd roared, their cheers a tide lifting her higher. Latoya felt the fire within her blaze, a legacy of her mother's words. "Don't let them trample your dignity." She saw Tasha's grin, James's nod, Clara's pride, and knew this was her victory, not just over the Carvers, but over every shadow that had tried to dim her. Olivia's letter sat unanswered in her desk, a question for another day. Forgiveness might come, but Latoya's focus was here, now, in the light she'd created. As guests mingled, Latoya stepped to the studio's window, Atlanta's skyline twinkling beyond. The city's pulse matched her own, a rhythm of resilience and hope. She touched the sign, Latoya's vision, its letters of vow etched in her soul. The Carvers had tried to break her, but they'd only forged her stronger. Her studio was more than a business. It was a beacon, a space where no one would kneel. She turned back to the crowd, her heart full, her fire eternal, ready to light the way for others as she'd done for herself. Latoya Jackson's fire burned through the Carvers' cruelty, transforming a maid's defiance into a beacon of dignity. From a slap to a studio, her journey proved no one can dim a light that refuses to fade. Will Olivia's redemption hold, or is Latoya's silence her final word? Share your thoughts. Where are you listening? What time is it? And what's your prediction for their paths? Your support fuels these stories, so thank you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and keep the conversation alive. Stay bold, stay true. Until next time.